Hello, I'm Em Roskowski. I've been a working journalist in North America for more than 30 years. Over the last 18 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all of us. It is arguably one of the most impactful events in the history of humanity. To date, this virus has infected over 200 million people around the world, and over 4 million have died of it. It's frightening that in many countries, including the United States, India, Brazil, France, Russia, Turkey, the United Kingdom, Peru, and other countries, variants of the virus are still spreading, with the future seeming uncertain. People are exhausted and anxiety-filled, wanting to know when it will all end. And perhaps even more importantly, at the end of 2019, where did this virus suddenly originate from? Is there an answer?
The problem we have is that we don't have definitive scientific evidence. It will again remain an argument, and those that have more, I would say, of a political agenda to argue that the origins was a laboratory one. Both are possible, but the probability weighs heavily in favor of a natural emergence. But you can't end this debate until we have the kind of evidence that clearly signals the origins is associated with one or the other.
Dr. Dennis Carroll serves as chair of the Global Virome Project Leadership Board. Previously, he served as the director at the U.S. Agency for International Development's Pandemic, Influenza, and Other Emerging Threats Unit. In this position, he led USAID's Emerging Pandemic Threats Program, a global effort to combat new disease threats before they become significant hazards to human health. He is trusted, published, and respected.
Well, as we were talking just a few moments ago, all of the information we have about the early stages of this pandemic are consistent with natural origins. But most importantly, what we do know is that the area in which this virus emerged is an area where coronaviruses of this type are in abundance, circulating in bats among wildlife populations.
Another renowned scientist, Dr. Jonna Mazet, is executive director and professor of epidemiology and disease ecology at the University of California, Davis Institute of Health. Mazet chairs the very important One Health Project, and she's the global director of USAID's PREDICT project. Mazet has established surveillance systems in more than 30 countries to halt the spread of the pandemic. She also holds important positions at the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine.
So these viruses hang out in their evolutionary host, and this particular one we're almost positive was from a bat, because of all the other coronaviruses that are similar to it that we've found in bats. So we're pretty sure that the original host was a bat, but whether it spilled over and exposed a naive human directly, or if it spilled over into an intermediate host, like was seen with the first SARS, which was a civet in a market, we're not sure.
Spillover, to be clear, means an animal virus was able to enter a human host. In other words, an animal to human viral transfer. This science-based conclusion isn't an anomaly. You need only undertake a simple internet search to prove this. And so we did. Using the keyword phrase COVID-19 virus origin, we found results comprised of 331 academic articles, 98% of them amounting to 324 supporting the view the virus has a natural origin or are inconclusive. Of these 331 articles, only 7 supported the opinion that the virus was leaked from a laboratory. That represents only 2% of published scientific opinion. From this simple search, we can conclude that a very collaborative belief has been fostered right across the scientific establishment that the virus either came from nature or the findings are currently inconclusive. Let me cite a few opinions publicly disclosed by scientists.
We have listened again and again to numerous scientists who've looked at the sequences, looked at this virus, and we are assured that this virus is natural in origin. And what is important is that we establish what that natural host for this virus is.
We have now, in our study in PNAS, unraveled the viral tree with the A, B, and C types. We can now do something very neat. We can apply the mutation rate of the virus like a clock to our tree and calculate when the outbreak occurred. And doing this, we find that the first infection, possibly from a bat to a human,
I always say, just like SARS, Nipah, everything else, if you don't know the origin, if you don't know the intermediate host, it's very hard to prevent future, outbreak. So the virus is most similar to the bat virus, so now suggests a zoonotic link.
Many scientific publications support the natural spillover viewpoint, such as The Lancet magazine, which is an internationally respected independent medical journal. On July 5th, 2020, The Lancet published a letter backed by 24 scientists which stated that the strongest evidence available to date suggests the coronavirus pandemic emerged via a natural spillover event. The letter follows up on a similar piece published in February 2020. This letter is signed by some of the most prominent virology specialists on the planet, including Sir Jeremy Farrar, a member of the UK's SAGE advisory group, Dr. Christian Drosten, a virologist and key figure in Germany's pandemic response, and Dr. Josie Golden, epidemic lead at the Wellcome Trust. In addition, several other respected science publications support this position too. Nature magazine published The COVID Lab Leak Hypothesis, What Scientists Do and Don't Know, on June 8, 2021. The author writes, most scientists say SARS-CoV-2 probably has a natural origin and was transmitted from animals to humans. Another article in Forbes magazine, dated June 9th, with this sobering headline: nearly half of Americans believe COVID-19 leaked from a Chinese lab, poll finds. It stated most scientists, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, continue to believe the virus originated in animals in the wild and was transmitted to humans. Although most scientists hold the lab leak theory lacks scientific evidence or is even scientifically unviable, what are the arguments from the people who advocate the lab leak theory? Firstly, most are not scientists. As the interviews in this video will bear, it is specific sources of media, writers, and public figures that have more vocally supported the lab leak theory. For example, the popular science writer and journalist Matt Ridley has asserted strongly the coronavirus leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, even though it is recognized as a P4 level biosecure facility. On May 2nd, 21, science correspondent Nicholas Wade published an article backing the lab leak theory because he had concerns about safety conditions at the Wuhan Institute, stating the new lab has a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians. However, Wade's staffing failure assessment has received no support from scientists who could provide independent corroboration of his claim. This appears then to be mere speculation. If and when the origin of SARS-CoV-2 is resolved, it should be by scientists, not speculation or unfounded theory. And yet, recent polls reveal a speculative movement in public opinion. A poll conducted by the British weekly The Economist and research organization YouGov from May 29th to June 1st, 21, showed 58% of Americans believe the COVID-19 virus originated in a Chinese lab. So only 13% of Americans agree with the scientific community's view. Another poll conducted by Morning Consult, a U.S. polling agency from June 10th to June 17th, 21, showed that a majority of people living in Italy, Spain, France, Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany believe in the Wuhan laboratory leak over a natural origin. Veteran investigative journalist Justin Ling gives us insight into this.
Yeah, I think the problem of misinformation, disinformation in the past few years has only grown, especially as the proliferation of social media and targeted disinformation campaigns and alternative news sites have cropped up. We've seen a rapid increase in the number of fake stories, fake trends, fake theories, conspiracy theories, flooding the zone, and frankly, leading to a general kind of radicalization, leading to a general disruption of our political and media systems, and frankly, leading to a further distrust in more trustworthy outlets.
Justin Ling is a veteran freelance journalist who specializes in covering stories untold, misunderstood, and often missed in the mainstream media. Thorough and outspoken, his work is often cited in flagship polls. His article, The Lab Leak Theory Doesn't Hold Up, has been published in The Atlantic and Foreign Policy, as well as other leading magazines. His work has also appeared in Canada's two national newspapers, the Globe and Mail and the National Post. Ling is also a much sought-after commentator on CBC, CTV, CNN, and the BBC.
Yeah, listen, I think there are two things going on. There are news outlets who are studying the possibility of a lab leak, who are reporting on the possibility that it emerged from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They're noting that even the World Health Organization has, kicked the tires on this theory and have studied it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. On the flip side, I think there is an entire cottage industry of journalists, quasi-journalists, political activists, politicians, and conspiracy theorists who want desperately for this to be true and are finding as many facts, half-facts, theories, bits of circumstantial evidence, or complete nonsense to cobble together a patchwork to try and suggest that this theory is not just possible or credible, but likely.
Yes, people should be listening to virology and epidemiology experts. But the first is, many of these experts are not particularly media friendly, that they are not good at delivering messages. Secondly, the interesting issue of the fact they might not agree with one another. It's not the science, it's science is.
Professor Adrian Furnham is a prominent psychologist and former professor at University College London. Throughout his storied career, he has published 92 books and over 1,200 peer-reviewed journal articles. In 2011, he was presented with the British Psychological Society of Academic Contribution to Practice Award. Alongside his books, Professor Furnham has also written newspaper pieces for the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and he is also a regular contributor to national and international radio and television channels such as the BBC, CNN, and ITV. From a psychologist's perspective, he describes how the human mind adopts coping mechanisms when dealing with the helplessness around a catastrophic scenario.
I think we should all be skeptical, not cynical, skeptical. That is, we think very carefully about what people are saying, what their motives for saying, but judging it according to scientific principles. It's terribly important not to be selfish and more important to be selfless. I think this is a pandemic. It's a very serious issue. And as people say, we're all in this together.
Unfortunately, public health measures of that type became politicized. They became part of the social or cultural wars. And what you have in an unprecedented way in the midst of a global health event, you have misinformation really driving people away from the very things that would save their lives. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are dead today. But what we're seeing is a dramatic fall off on the daily numbers of people who are getting vaccinated. Really among populations that are subscribing to the misinformation, the fears that these rumors perpetuate. And as a consequence, this pandemic will continue to play itself out among those populations that are unvaccinated. And one of the real concerns is that those populations will become, if you will, the seeding grounds for the emergence of new variants that could put at risk the efficacy, the effectiveness of those vaccines that are already available. So they're not only putting their own lives at risk, but they, by basis of this misinformation, are taking real measures to potentially prolong and further amplify the impact of this pandemic.
Clearly, experts believe public opinion has been influenced by salacious headlines and amplified misinformation published through various streams of social media, opinion pieces, and even politically motivated mainstream media. In contrast, science publications can be technically dense and less of a dramatic read. In a frantic news world competing for eyeballs and clickbait 24 hours a day, scientific analysis can come across to the casual reader or listener as dry, hard to understand, perhaps even boring. But this is scientifically backed news that needs to be reaching a wider audience. Our latest online searches found over 1,100 articles and reports on the source of COVID-19, 56% of which indicated the coronavirus originated in a laboratory. By carefully reading similar articles provided by the media on the origin of the COVID-19 virus, we can see a clear tendency that while such articles try to avoid conclusively affirming that the virus came from a laboratory, they often imply that the Wuhan lab leak theory is a mainstream view. This is contrary to what scientists believe. As you've seen here, the majority of the scientific community has not concluded a lab leak theory as factual. Scientific voices have been ignored while public opinion has been shaped by theories and stories. So why are false theories taking root and growing? Let's turn to an expert on this.
Yeah, so it's very challenging in order to convey fast-moving scientific findings or to deal with the fact that there might just be uncertainty on a certain question, because journalists want to convey, what the answer is, and people expect to know what the answer is. And so the lab leak theory is a good example of this, where the state of scientific opinion at the beginning of the pandemic was broadly that the zoonotic origin was most likely, although there was uncertainty, and that an origin from a lab was less likely. And journalists don't really know how to delicately tailor those stories to acknowledge that uncertainty, because people want certainty, they crave certainty, and people that are prone to conspiratorial ideation tend to have a high degree of need for cognitive closure. That is, they can't really deal with uncertainty. They need to know the answer. And so that sort of uncertainty breeds those sorts of, and ultimately we just haven't figured out a way to accurately convey that information with the sensitivity that's needed.
Eric Merkley is an assistant professor of political science in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Merkley intently studies political communication, public opinion, American and Canadian politics. He has been published in the American Political Science Review, Nature, Human Behavior, the Journal of Politics, and the British Journal of Political Science.
But probably the most important bias that exists is as a result of journalists' need to have an audience for what they're trying to convey. And so this is just kind of survival bias in a sense, in an era where journalists are under a lot of pressure. Mainstream news outlets are in a much more competitive environment. A lot of outlets are shutting their doors or cutting staff. It's more important than at any other point in time to get clicks, to get engagement in stories. And so that has a bearing on terms of what news stories journalists choose to cover and avoid. So some topics are much more click-worthy than others.
Professor Merkley's analysis illustrates that in order to survive fractured audiences and low attention spans, the media must capture the audience's attention and cater to audience psychology. If it bleeds, it leads is an old news tenet. It means the more dramatic the headline, the bigger the audience. But science and scientists' judgments are by their very nature serious, sometimes even mind-numbing, and often fail to capture the psychology or imagination of the modern, distracted audience of today.
But a lot of people get frustrated by that. They want clear and compelling answers immediately, right away. And for good reason, because they want to be able to structure their lives. They want to know how to best protect themselves. But unfortunately, the scientific process is slow, cumulative, and sometimes there are contradictory findings, and that's just the way it is. And so COVID-19 specifically has thrown a lot of other complications into science communication.
Those sound bites that speak about paranoia, conspiracy, are ones that have outweighed the messaging from the public health community about protection and safety. And what we saw with this particular pandemic was not a scientific failure, but a political failure. We saw the failure of leadership. But remarkably, what we saw was sort of an uneven distribution of that failure. We saw, certainly within the West, within Europe, and within North America, absolute failure of leadership.
And there's more. In a BBC website article dated July 10th, 21, titled, COVID-19 Origins, Scientists Weigh Evidence for Origin of Virus, one scientist came under attack for their conclusions, and I quote, "Some scientists who had publicly dismissed the lab leak scenario came under attack, particularly on social media. One who has worked on SARS-CoV-2's evolutionary origins since the pandemic's early days says the evidence points to a natural spillover. It's been reported he considered leaving his field of research because the abuse had become so bad. The researcher, who did not want to be identified due to fear of further harassment, said, 'I've had email hacks, emails that attempt to entrap me, and claims that I faked data and am part of a sort of systemic cover-up, and others have had it far, far worse. All of this takes a toll and makes you question your worth, putting fear of reprisals into our scientists. Now that is a lot to take in.'"
There's been a diminishing of respect for science, at least here. I hope that's not the case everywhere around the world, but at least here, I think scientists have felt very targeted as not that useful, and I think scientists do need to get better at making their information accessible, but we also need it to be a two-way street so that people are listening and trusting us again. And then again, we need to really break down the walls within our government, between agencies, but also between and among governments all over the world.
Initially, in the early stages of the pandemic, there was a desire for Trump to kind of off responsibility onto China. And so that Republican leaders and Trump pushed that linkage as much as possible in order to evade responsibility. And allies in the media kind of carried out that messaging faithfully, as you would expect, given their political leanings. And so that did lend this whole issue an ideological charge that it probably shouldn't have, because ultimately, whatever the origins of COVID-19, has not a whole lot of bearing in terms of how we deal with it right now through vaccination, through social distancing and masks. But that political charge has surrounded it and complicated matters a great deal. We do see how partisan media can kind of jump on scientific uncertainty or these sorts of things to serve their own ends. And in this case, it was carrying Trump's water.
As the number of infected people in the COVID-19 pandemic approaches 200 million and more than 4 million dead, the obvious goal is for scientists to be free to study and identify methods to prevent the spread of the virus and to reduce the loss of life. And doesn't it make sense to leave the investigation into the origins of the pandemic to the scientists themselves? Because who understands this virus best? And it seems some recent media reports are leaning in this direction too. To quote a July 10th, 21 BBC article, while the arguments have escalated over the past year, there have been no new scientific evidence pointing to a laboratory leak. And significantly, scientists almost all agree that a robust search for evidence of SARS-CoV-2's origin is the only positive way forward. Additionally, NPR, or the National Public Radio, reported on their website, July 19th, that University of Arizona biologist Michael Warby, who once supported the idea of a virus coming from a laboratory, has now recently changed his views, saying, "I do think transmission from another species without a lab escape is the most likely scenario by a long shot."
This is a time for science and solidarity. Wild conspiracy theories are infecting the internet. Hatred is going viral, stigmatizing and vilifying people and groups. The world must unite against this disease too. And the vaccine is trust. First, trust in science. And I salute the journalists and others fact-checking the mountain of misleading stories and social media posts.
If scientific research confirms the source of the COVID-19 virus, then no matter what the truth is, we can be assured it will be a major scientific event for all of humanity and well deserving of global attention. Why don't we wait for that day? Do you agree? I'm Em Roskowski. Thank you for watching.